Let us pray. In our mind's eye, let us see the awesome grandeur of the Rockies, the denseness of our forests, the fertility of our farmland, the splendor of our rivers, the riches of our resources. Then, O Lord, let us rededicate ourselves as wise stewards of such bounty on behalf of all Albertans. Amen.
Introduction of visitors.
Mr. Speaker, honorable members, at a special luncheon today, I was delighted to present the first annual Alberta Environment Awards. It is particularly fitting that this presentation should take place during Environment Week, the special week in the year during which we celebrate the wealth of natural beauty that is our environment. The award recipients were selected by a committee which included representatives from the Environment Council of Alberta, Dr. Sherry Dalton and Professor Rick Mazurek, the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, and Alberta Environment. It is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce to you and to the people of Alberta the award recipients for the first ever awarding of Alberta Environment Awards. First, I would like to introduce Mr. Dan Stoker, the award recipient for individual achievement. Mr. Stoker is an environmental educator who has been instrumental in promoting the study of the environment in Alberta schools and through volunteer organizations for more than 10 years. Mr. Stoker has given freely of his personal time to help educators and organizations better understand the environment and the critical role they play in guiding their students and the public to become environmentally conscious citizens. The award recipient in the educational institution or organization category is the Society, Environment and Energy Development Study, known more commonly as the SEEDS Foundation. With us today is the Foundation's Executive Director, Mr. Hugh Phillips. The SEEDS Foundation is a recognized leader in environmental education. It is a non-profit organization that is responsible for such high-quality materials as the Energy Literacy Series. The Foundation has also played a special role in encouraging consultation and cooperation among the broad range of government, public, and private associations involved in environmental education. I was also delighted to be able to present the award for corporate achievement to Shell Canada Limited. Here, representing Shell Canada, are Mr. Ed Shia, Executive Vice President, Resource Group, and Dr. Doug Mead of Shell Safety and Environmental Affairs Division. The long-term commitment of this corporation to sound environmental management has had a very positive impact in this province and has set high standards for industry in the area of environmental protection. The environmental protection measures taken by Shell in connection with the Moose Mountain pipeline project in the Calgary area were particularly commended by the members of the Awards Committee. Mr. Speaker, the Alberta Environment Awards hold a very special significance for me. They are an opportunity for me to demonstrate my appreciation to the dedicated individuals and groups that share the government's concern for and commitment to the environment. The worthy individuals and organizations represented here today are without peer in this province and are without doubt deserving of this honor. Mr. Speaker, prior to me asking them to rise, I would also like to announce to all members of the Legislative Assembly the winner of the City Water Tasting Contest that was held in conjunction with Environment Week in Alberta. All cities of Alberta were asked to submit to an independent group water from their particular jurisdiction, and I'm pleased to announce that the city of Lethbridge has the best tasting water in the province of Alberta. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all members join with us in recognizing our guests and their guests at this very important occasion. Thank you.
Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions.
I move that the petition I presented to the Assembly yesterday be now read and received.
To the Honourable, the Legislative Assembly of Alberta in Legislature assembled. The petition of the undersigned residents of the province of Alberta shows that due consideration ought to be given to all aspects of the agreement to amend the Constitution of Canada entered into by the Prime Minister and the 10 provincial premiers January 3, 1987, prior to that agreement being formally approved by your Honourable Assembly. Wherefore your petitioners humbly pray that your Honourable Assembly may be pleased to provide for the referral of the proposed amendments and the motion that they be approved to the Standing Committee on Public Affairs for the purpose of that committee holding public hearings on the proposed amendments and approval motion prior to the question on the motion being put in the Legislative Assembly. And as in duty bound, your petitioners will ever pray. Presenting reports by standing and special committees.
Chair hesitates to interrupt clerk, but what has transpired with regard to the petition is a highly unusual form of petition whereby members are in effect petitioning themselves. And the chair has allowed it to be in order, but would like to point out that in actual fact such a practice has only occurred in British parliamentary practice once, and that was as recently as the 30th of August, 1841.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce a bill being the Chartered Accountants Act, Bill number 50.
The Honourable Minister of Labour has moved for first reading Bill number 50, Chartered Accountants Act. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries.
Bill 50, being Chartered Accountants Act, introduced by Honourable Dr. Reid, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I further request leave to introduce a bill being the Certified Management Accountants Act, Bill 51.
The Minister of Labour has moved for first reading Bill 51, Certified Management Accountants Act. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill 51, Certified Management Accountants Act, introduced by Honourable Dr. Reid, is now read a first time.
There you are, you're right on cue. Go for it, Ian. Go for it.
Mr. Speaker, I knew that we were on television. I didn't know that we were members of the J. Arthur Rank organisation. Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce a further bill being the Certified General Accountants Act, Bill number 52. Mr. Speaker, the three bills I've just introduced will, when proclaimed, introduce a new era for professional accountancy in the province of Alberta.
The Chair hopes that this instant tradition is not going to be followed of every time a minister introduces three bills in one day that we're going to have a ringing of the bells. The Honourable Minister of Labour has introduced for first reading Bill number 52, the Certified General Accountants Act. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill 52, being Certified General Accountants Act, introduced by Honourable Dr. Reid, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill 273, the Family Farm Protection Act. This legislation creates a debt mediation process with teeth capable of intervening between farmers and their creditors in a meaningful and effective way.
The Honourable Member for Vegreville has moved first reading of Bill 273, Family Farm Protection Act. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill 273, being Family Farm Protection Act, introduced by Honourable Member Mr. Fox, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very honoured today and proud to be able to table the historic constitutional accord that was unanimously agreed upon and signed by all First Ministers in Canada on Wednesday. For the first I express my appreciation to the members for that response, Mr. Speaker. I was just going to say that for the first time in our nation's 120-year history, for the first time, we now have a made-in-Canada Constitution endorsed by all the provinces in the federal government of Canada.
Introduction of special guests.
Minister of Public Works, Supply and Services.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today to introduce to you and to the members of the Assembly 32 grade 6 students from the Notre Dame Elementary School in the town of Bonnyville, located in the heart of the lakeland and the hub of the heavy oil activity of this province. They're accompanied today by 2 teachers, Mrs. Marie-Louise Lacourse and Mrs. Suzanne Antonuc, 4 parents, Mrs. Deschênes, Mrs. Willette, Mr. Charbonneau, and Mrs. Dottie. They're seated in the members' gallery, and I'd ask that they stand and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Member for McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is indeed a special pleasure today to welcome 63 students, along with 3 teachers and 3 parents, to the legislature. These students attend the St. Wilfrid School and have always taken an interest in political awareness, and I'm also proud to have been able to assist them from time to time. These students, of course, are some of the cream of the crop from Northeast Calgary, and with them, the teachers are Mr. Gorman, Mr. McDonald, Mr. Rizzuti. The parents are Mrs. Brenzar, Mrs. Walsh, and Mrs. Toms. I would like to ask that they rise, the group of, there's about 70 altogether, and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
I have a special guest today from the University of Bombay, Dr. Rajwant Kaur Gurewal. He's seated in the public gallery. And if I can take your indulgence to give him a greeting, Sat Sri Akal Ji. And I wonder if he would rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of the legislature.
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege today to introduce to the members of the Assembly and yourself 6 people who have worked very hard on the legislation I introduced this afternoon. They represent the 3 professional accounting groups in the province, and these gentlemen and their predecessors have, as some would know, put very considerable effort into the legislation that was introduced today. I'd ask them to rise as I introduce them. Some are in your gallery and some are in the members' gallery. Representing the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Alberta, Mr. Keith Adams, the President, and Mr. Bill Halford, the Vice President and President-elect. From the Society of Management Accountants of Alberta, Mr. Bob McCullough, the Vice President and President-elect, and Mr. Keith Crowder, the Executive Director. And from the Certified General Accountants Association of Alberta, Mr. Wolfgang Kosch, the President, and Mr. Clancy Fewhurst, the Executive Vice President. I would like the members of the Assembly to give them the welcome they deserve for having worked so hard on behalf of Albertans.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct my first question to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure all members of the Assembly recognize and appreciate the effort of the Premier and his colleagues in persevering, I would say, to make an agreement on constitutional reform. I'd like to congratulate the Premier for his hard work, and I hope that he catches up with his sleep at some time in the weekend. Mr. Speaker, it's an excellent and important document, but I hope the Premier appreciates that there may be potential for improvement, and that in my reading, Mr. Speaker, several premiers have indicated their willingness to to entertain changes in the agreement if it is the wish of the people in one or more of the provinces. My question to the Premier, does the Premier share this willingness to entertain potential improvements to the document?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would appreciate, the Government of Alberta does not lightly sign an accord of this significance, and therefore, when they sign it, they feel very much bound to honour it. I think all of the First Ministers, though, expressed this one reservation to that position, and that is if there was some clear horrible mistake or unanticipated error that was so clear that had to be changed, then we would meet together to consider that. But other than that, I do not see where we would be bringing changes to that historical accord.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Of course, a horrible mistake might be in the eye of the beholder. People might look at it differently. But, Mr. Speaker, a constitution which is not accepted by people and not explained to people is not a constitution that will be very well accepted. As the Premier knows, I accept a majority of things in the court, and I think it's an important document. But my question is, does the Premier not recognize the right of Albertans to have their say on this accord through a public hearing process prior to a vote in the Legislative Assembly? It's my understanding that the federal Parliament is doing this and many of the other provinces.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the people of Alberta are never more properly represented than here in this legislature, because here we have the MLAs who have stood for election against other contestants and candidates and have been elected by the people to come to this legislature, represent them, debate the laws and resolutions, which this is, and then approve it or turn it down. This is the best public hearing in our province, and I believe that with the adequate safeguards built into any resolution for debate in this legislature, this is the proper place to do it. We as a government are elected to make decisions and then proceed with those decisions. We are doing that.
Well, supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. It seems to me that the role of elected representatives is also to listen rather than talk in this legislature. And I do not recall any of us being elected or even a campaign issue on constitutional amendment changes. I don't think the Albertans have had a chance to have their say on that. And all due respect, Mr. Premier. But my question is to the Premier, saying that other provinces are doing it and the federal government, why should Albertans be penalized by not having these public hearings as they are in other parts of the country?
Mr. Speaker, the federal government, recognizing that the Senate was probably going to have hearings as well, felt that they could have joint common Senate hearings, I believe, and therefore they would do that. As far as other provinces, by far the vast majority are not having public hearings. It is true that the province of Manitoba has built into their orders or rules that they must have public hearings. Ontario, the members might know, of course, is a minority government and might well consider that now is not the right time to introduce it, and public hearings might take their place. But the other governments are proceeding from the signing on Tuesday to introduce the resolution and to have it passed in their legislature.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest to the Premier that a constitution is very different than other matters that we discuss in this Legislative Assembly, and the people should have a say on their constitution. It's very basic. And I notice that we spent over $500,000 on labor hearings that we haven't even heard about. Why is it that we can have public hearings on labor laws? When it comes to the Constitution, we're not going to have the people give their say on what they want.
Well, Mr. Speaker, within that question is a fundamental misunderstanding of what this legislature is all about. Here is the place where you proceed with laws or resolutions that require approval on behalf of the people of Alberta. Here is the place where it is guaranteed that the debate takes place. And For my part, Mr. Speaker, every MLA should come armed with information provided to him from his or her constituents and then participate in the debate. But as I said before, we were elected to do these things. We are a government asked by the people to represent them. We are representing them, and we will proceed to, we have made the decision, we'll proceed then to put it into place.
LeBeau, followed by Westlock Sturgeon.
Supplementary question to the Premier. Public hearings not being granted, we'll need to have MLA hearings instead. Could the Premier indicate when the resolution will be presented to this legislature so that we can initiate that process into our timetable?
Mr. Speaker, the exact wording of the resolution, which will go, and it must be the same resolution before every provincial legislature, will be available shortly. If we have it soon, we will present it soon, the makeup of the resolution, the exact wording, to the legislature, and then we will let the legislature itself decide as to when and how it debates it.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, one of the reasons that our caucus did not give a standing ovation was the knowledge that the Premier had already told everyone that he was going to use his ham fist and heavy-handed majority to ram through this, no matter what the public of Alberta thought. Now, if indeed, yes, you can imagine how much hearings mean to that tame bunch of pussycats, Mr. Speaker. He hollers the signals. Now, Mr. Speaker, what I'd like to ask the Premier is, in view of the fact that if any of the legislatures in this country amend this in any way, the whole process starts over. Is he going to take it unilaterally upon himself, if there's an amendment made anywhere in Canada, to still use his ham-handed, heavy-fisted majority to ram through what his opinion is of what is the most important thing that's happened in 100 years in Confederation?
Mr. Speaker, I've already dealt with the matter, and I've said, of course, that before this becomes law and amends our Constitution, all legislatures must approve it. That answers for itself the question for the honourable member, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary, Banff Cochrane.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, the matter of changes raised by the Leader of the Opposition is of concern. Would the Premier confirm that during these important discussions, that the Premier of Manitoba argued strongly for the federal government to take over provincial jurisdiction and fiscal responsibilities?
Mr. Speaker, when discussing a matter that is before the First Ministers, I've always felt important to express what I say in the meetings, and then to allow other premiers to express from a closed meeting what they said. But that has been altered slightly by the fact of the matter of a press release from one of the parties in this legislature who praised the role of Manitoba Premier Pauley regarding shared cost programs and federal spending ability. And I think one of the most essential, fundamental beliefs of our government is involved in that issue which was raised by the opposition. And that is, we understand and appreciate their position, which is they believe in large government, they believe in strong central control, and that they would place that control in Ottawa. That's right. That is so, well, I appreciate their position. I'm not saying that that's what they are philosophically committed to. Now, Mr. Speaker, that is so fundamentally different from our position, because in order to fulfill that commitment of theirs, they are prepared to give up the jurisdictional rights that the Constitution gives to a province, because the federal spending power that we were debating is only involved in those areas of exclusive provincial rights. And they are prepared, and I think all Albertans must consider this, in order to give that power to the central government, they were prepared to give away the provincial rights of Albertans. We will never, ever agree with that.
Main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Kept the level at the low level that the Premier's brought it down to, and he knows that that's absolute nonsense.
Distortion.
Distortions. Shame on you.
Shame.
Mr. Speaker.
Shame.
But we'll go to one of the programs that they are trying to dismantle to the Minister.
Honourable Leader, I understand one's sense of frustration perhaps, but perhaps we could have the second main question.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to come to one of the programs that we're talking about that they're trying to dismantle that Albertans want. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about Medicare to the Minister over there. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister professed some ignorance to the serious overcrowding at the Royal Alec Hospital. And the Minister said he doesn't know if allegations of overcrowding by Dr. David Irwin, the hospital chief of staff, are correct. Now, this seems to me to be rather an incredible statement coming from this Minister of Health, and I've heard some incredible statements. But why did the Minister fail to follow up on this matter when I brought it to his attention in the Legislative Assembly on March the 12th?
Mr. Speaker, the situation with regard to the alleged overcrowding at the Royal Alec Hospital on yesterday and from June 1st was not a matter that I had had a full report on until late yesterday afternoon. I now have that report, and for the interest of honourable members, they may wish to know that on June 1st, the Royal Alexander Hospital closed 100 beds for a 2 to 3 month fire and safety upgrading program. The beds were not closed as a direct result of any budgetary reductions, but rather for those purposes. This had been a closure that had been planned for some months in order to take advantage of the period of time during the summer when there's usually a lesser demand upon hospital services, particularly for elective surgery. I might add as well that there apparently was some mix-up or some misunderstanding between the doctor involved in the hospital, as the hospital had not indicated to the patient in question that a bed was available, and so the patient had arrived without the hospital knowing that in fact that patient was coming in for a bed that afternoon. That has since been straightened out with respect to the individual patient in question, and that patient is now in the hospital. I should advise as well that during the course of June 1st, there were approximately 50 beds amongst 4 other major hospitals in Calgary in Edmonton that were vacant and could have accommodated emergency patients. One has to understand, however, that the doctor in question had privileges only at the Royal Alec Hospital and couldn't have moved a patient to another hospital without having utilized the services of another doctor. In short, Mr. Speaker, I reviewed the matter at some length, and while it is unfortunate that these things occur in the event that a hospital closes that many beds on one day, it is something I think that the system can adequately overcome if all of the hospitals work together to make sure that there's good knowledge of when beds are available and what other hospitals might have beds available for emergency purposes.
Mr. Speaker, I'm appalled by the answer, because long before the cuts, there was overcrowding at the Royal Alec Hospital, and the Premier's over there and made it as part of his election promise. And to say that there's no problem after you cut off $7 million is nonsense. But I want to make sure, is this what this minister's saying, that the Royal Alec, there's absolutely no problems there, there's not overcrowding, and things are going along fine? Is that what he's telling the people in Edmonton?
Well, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition preferred not to listen to my answer, I guess. What I said was that the Royal Alec Hospital closed 100 beds on June 1st for a previously planned upgrading program, and indeed there was a problem. There was a mix-up with respect to one particular patient as to whether or not a bed would be available. There were no beds available that day. There was apparently in that particular case, at least anyway, not the kind of coordination that might have been desired between that hospital and others. Members would know that just because one hospital is overcrowded doesn't mean we should add beds to it when there are other hospitals in the city that are able to take those patients. And as the situation with regard to hospital operating costs becomes difficult for hospitals, there's a great deal more coordination required than before. We have to make sure that emergency services like ambulance operators are aware of other hospitals' bed availability and emergency availability so that that too can be spread, or the load can be spread over a greater number of hospitals. So in short, Mr. Speaker, I think the system is doing everything it possibly can to make sure these things don't happen, but occasionally they do.
The system's doing everything it can in spite of a conservative government. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not only the beds. The diagnostic capacity is overused. We're told, for example, that they're built to do 30,000 tests a year, but are doing 120,000.
That's right.
So because, as the minister's saying, that the $7 million that they've cut from the Royal Alec budget is having no effect in terms of beds or diagnostic service, that everything is going along fine.
I didn't say it was having no effect at all. As a matter of fact, the reduction in budgets in every hospital has meant that they've had to utilize a variety of means to meet the budgetary requirements for this year. I believe, though, that it's fair to say the Royal Alec, in terms of providing a greater amount of their dollars into things like day surgery, in terms of the kinds of beds they have closed, in terms of their effort to move long-term care patients out of their hospital, is doing a very good job. But it is unfortunate that when you decide well in advance to have an upgrading program on 100 beds and they have to be closed on a given day, one can expect that at that point in time the hospital is going to be very, very full. We're fortunate that patients can be looked after in emergency areas and so on while that sort of thing is sorted out. We're also fortunate that this city has a number of other hospitals, several of which had room on that day and have room today for emergency patients.
I don't think the minister's ever been even down to the Royal Alec. He wouldn't
right.
be making these statements if he goes down the halls. The Premier was over and made an election commitment that if it was needed, there would be an upgrading. I'm told that on April the 7th, a plan was submitted to this minister back in April the 7th where they would need $80 million to fulfill that election pledge. When is the minister going to get down to doing something about it?
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, my predecessor approved several years ago an upgrading program for the Royal Alec Hospital involving some $48 million in a number of different programs. The hospital suggested that that was insufficient funding for what they had in mind, and there were additional programs and buildings that needed to be upgraded, and that's correct that the Premier did visit there and made a commitment that we would consider a new proposal from the hospital. Now that was about a year ago, in April of 1986. It took the hospital 12 months to develop that new proposal, and I see nothing wrong with that. It's a very complicated process of considering how hospitals should be upgraded and what programs should be improved upon, but they completed that work, submitted it to me in April. The staff of my department are now in the process of reviewing the request that came forward and consulting with staff of the hospital to determine the reasons behind many of the requests they're making. That review will take some time, and when it's completed, I will then be in a position to make recommendations to the Finance Committee of Cabinet as to whether or not we can proceed with planning on the program that has been submitted to us, or whether or not there's some amendments need to be made to it. I'm hopeful that all of that can occur well short of the year that it took the hospital to develop the program.
West Loch Sturgeon supplementary, followed by Vermilion Biken.
Supplementary to the minister with the question of shortage of beds at any particular time. Is there a central registry that coordinates or lists vacant beds in the Edmonton and metropolitan or other provincial areas, or is it left entirely to the patient's family, and the hospital to try to find a bed if there is a shortage in any particular hospital?
There is, Mr. Speaker, with respect to long-term care patients, a central registry, Hospital District number 24, provides all of the information with respect to admittance and waiting lists there. But with regard to the active treatment hospitals, there is not, to my knowledge, a central registry, and I don't believe there needs to be, but there does need to be good coordination between the staffs of all the major hospitals in Edmonton so that they know, particularly when they're fairly full, so that they know where beds are available. There also has to be that kind of coordination between the hospitals and the Edmonton Ambulance Authority, and I've asked staff of my department to look into that matter and make certain that there is the kind of coordination required between the hospitals, the Ambulance Authority, and the hospitals themselves so that every available bed is used in cases of emergency.
Vermilion Viking.
Yes, to the Minister, a supplementary. I toured the Royal Alec the day of the snowstorm and was shown where in the Women's Pavilion they had closed 22 beds, and yet on a projection with the new recommendations by doctors of early release, they could see in the near future they'd be down to 80% utilization. Could the Minister indicate if these same recommendations were brought into the acute care complexes, if we could project the same decrease in utilization of the active treatment beds?
Well, I can't predict that, Mr. Speaker. The only thing that I can say is that some hospitals, and the most notable one in Alberta is the Foothills Hospital in Calgary, have taken some very aggressive steps, particularly in their surgery department, to ensure that there's a shorter turnaround time of patients, wherein the chief of surgery there has asked all surgeons in that hospital to make certain that patients come in the day of surgery rather than 1 or 2 or 3 days before, and that they're released as soon as possible once their surgery's been completed. I'm advised that there's been a considerable saving already by initiating those steps. I do not know whether or not the Royal Alexander Hospital is approaching the matter the same way, but I'm hopeful that they and other hospitals will look very closely at these kinds of savings of bed days. Because surely when we have a reduction of only 3% in a hospital's budget, it's not necessary for them to give any lesser medical care than they give now if they use all of the innovative ways that are possible to speed up the movement in and out of patients and to cut down on their operating costs.
Main question, Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is to the Premier also, in respect to the Meech Lake Accord, and I can't express how disappointed our party is that he's not holding open hearings. As a matter of fact, I think it's an issue so important, Mr. Speaker, he could consider dissolving the House and calling an election on the issue. But nevertheless, there are ambiguities. Yes, I'll take you on any place you want on this issue. Yes, any place. You resign and I'll resign. We'll go at it together. Yeah, a bunch of cowards there. There's ambiguities that remain in the Constitutional Accord. Somebody's been rattling their cage, and they're full of vim and vigor. Furthermore, I'm surprised that the ministers felt that there were so few changes necessary in putting this accord into legal terms. Now, to the Premier, on April the 4th, the Premier stated that the federal government would have to discuss, end of quote, the national objectives of shared cost programs with provinces before implementing them. Is that still the Premier's understanding of the process contained in yesterday's agreement?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker.
Well then, Mr. Speaker, I would like the Premier to point out just where in the accord that he signed yesterday that it says the provinces will be consulted. Just point out where it says so.
Mr. Speaker, it's inherent in dealing with the matter of whether a program is compatible with federal objectives, whether or not the program meets national objectives. Let's all understand that national objectives are not just Ottawa's objectives. National objectives are the objectives of this whole nation.
It's inherent, like expecting a free vote from those bunch of backbenchers he has on an issue such as this. Is the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is the Premier concerned that concepts such as a program of initiative being, quote, compatible with the national objectives will be challenged at some point and will be in the courts? Will end up making, the courts will be the ones that end up making the law on this matter, not the Premier, not the Accord?
Mr. Speaker, who could possibly give any future prediction of that? I don't know. And often it would depend on how a federal government conducted itself and how a provincial government conducted itself, whether one or the other might end up in court over the way they conducted themselves. But what is so inherent in the way the premiers have been discussing this matter is that we have a new kind of federalism, a new kind of cooperation, and one that is built on negotiation and consultation, and one that has built into it a degree of decentralization. Now, I understand the frustration for the honourable member. I know his party doesn't know where they stand on this whole matter. And I understand that he would therefore try and attack it. But I must say, Mr. Speaker, that this fundamental matter of federal spending powers to get around exclusive provincial rights is absolutely at the heart of the future of Alberta, and we will defend it in every way we possibly can.
Speaker, I'm frustrated. Think how he feels when he sees 300 right-wingers sitting in Vancouver putting a new party together. Now, did the Premier raise with the First Ministers, I'm allowed one sentence, Mr. Speaker, did the Premier raise with his First Ministers the option of electing senators for the time being until such time as we achieve Senate reform?
Mr. Speaker, it may have been discussed briefly, but not in any great detail, because we had the matter of Senate reform now entrenched in the Constitution and a means of handling it in the meantime. And so it was not a big issue.
Supplementary, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I'd say to the Premier that he knows full well that this party has been strong for provincial rights in Alberta and Saskatchewan. That's why I was a little bit amazed by his reaction. But never mind, Treasurer, you screwed up the budget. We'll get down. But my question to the Premier, my question to the Premier, he's getting a little exercise, his face is getting red. My question to the Premier, if he's so sure that Albertans support him on that, and I generally agree with the principles, why are we so afraid then to go out and have public hearings about it? I don't understand that reluctance if he's so sure that it's correct.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's no fear of the public hearings. The fact of the matter is that we have a legislature where these things are supposed to be debated and then decisions made. And that's what we are doing as a government. And let me say this as well. This is a historic time for Canada and for Alberta. But this is a constitutional amendment. There are many, many other things that Albertans wish to see us taking time with. The matter of diversification, energy, employment, building our future, building our communities. All of these things, of course, we have to continue to work at as well.
Supplementary, Calgary McCall.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the opposition parties who would sell us down the drain, would the Premier confirm that under Section 148 of the 1987 Constitutional Accord, that the protection that has been espoused by the member from West Loch Sturgeon is placed into this accord by having the meetings once a year with the First Ministers?
Mr. Speaker, it's an excellent matter which the honourable member has raised, because there's no question that as a result of leadership by former Premier Lougheed and Alberta government, who stressed the need for federal, provincial, First Ministers meetings annually in order that items such as shared cost programs, federal spending power, would be guaranteed a debate at the national level of all First Ministers. Now, what happened, Mr. Speaker, of course, is that was always at the whim of a Prime Minister. Not any longer, because that leadership has found its way into our Constitution, so that now those matters are guaranteed. There will be First Ministers' meetings on the economy where these matters can be discussed and nobody can take it out.
Supplementary or main question? Main question, Leader of the Representative Party, followed by Edmonton Highlands.
My main question is to the Premier as well. I'd first of all like to express my appreciation to the Premier for the hard work on behalf of the legislature in terms of the Accord and congratulate him on the progress. Certainly that leaves us as members still the opportunity to discuss it here and look at the details. My questions to the Premier and Mr. Speaker are in terms of interpretation of some of the sections, and I'd like to start with Part 6, the constitutional conferences there that give us the opportunity of further discussion on Senate reform. Could the Premier indicate the extent of that commitment beyond the item just being on the agenda? Was there any type of informal agreement with the other premiers or the Prime Minister as to the direction that Senate reform could be taken in further discussions?
Difficult for me to answer completely on that because, of course, the Prime Minister said yesterday on national television that he recognizes how strongly the West feel about Senate reform and therefore that he would be calling he pledged to call the first meeting as quickly as possible and to bring some proposals. But we also discussed amongst ourselves some proposals. There is one proposal, and that's the Triple E. One of the things that I'm so pleased about in this accord is the fact that it confirms unanimously the equality of provinces, the constitutional equality of provinces. Now that's very effective because I feel quite certain in my mind that all members all of the First Ministers would like to see an effective Senate. And I think to be effective, there's general acceptance it must be an elected Senate. Therefore, knowing the interest of the honourable member and this legislature in the third E, the equal Senate, I think we have, by getting the First Minister's meetings in the Constitution where we meet equally around a table, and then having it confirmed at least twice in the Accord, which was yesterday, assigned yesterday, we have the basis for arguing, obviously, the constitutional equality of every province. And therefore that, I believe, should carry over into our debate on Senate reform. And I'm looking forward to that very much.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question. In signing the Accord, and the Premier has made reference to it that each province will have equal say in the voting of constitutional change. Could the Premier indicate in the process that will initiate itself after the final signing of the Accord, where we have greater opportunity for the implementation or the enhancement of opportunity for the implementation of the Triple E Senate or Senate reform because of that new process being initiated?
Am I understanding the question right is whether or not I feel there is an enhanced capacity to obtain a Triple E Senate because of the Accord? Yes, I definitely do. As I said when we signed the document, that for the first time in Canadian history, all the governments in Canada must deal with the issue of Senate reform. And as I've said, the Triple E embodies what is really in this Constitution now. And I think, well, some have argued, and perhaps I should deal with this matter if that's what the honourable member is getting at, that moving from the 7 provinces 50% feature, that it makes it tougher to obtain that because of unanimity. Well, unanimity, of course, carries on the equality feature. I mean, if you only give certain provinces a veto, then obviously you're not equal. And I think if we're going to fight for equality, you know that you must fight for unanimity, and everybody must have the same vote. I'd say just this, because there have been people who are talking, Mr. Speaker, about the impossibility of unanimity, or how difficult it is. Well, I'd only draw to the honourable member's attention, and Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important because Albertans and Western Canadians think so much about a Triple E Senate, that when people say you can't get unanimity, and if I could just say, I was thinking of this flying home in the plane. Over the years, there's been unanimous support for such things as the Canada Pension Plan, of course, and unemployment insurance. But more recently, we have unanimously agreed on the Edmonton Declaration here in Alberta. We have unanimously agreed on new immigration matters. We have unanimously agreed on input to Supreme Court appointments. We have unanimously agreed on the fundamental characteristics of Canada. We have unanimously agreed for annual First Ministers' conferences. We have unanimously agreed on the matter of provincial input into Senate appointments. I mean, there has been a pattern of unanimous agreement to matters that will all lead, I believe, to a far greater potential under the current Constitution, as it's been amended, for the possibility of a Triple E Senate.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Premier, in terms of the clause that provides for Quebec to be recognized as a distinct society, could the Premier indicate whether that clause was assessed in terms of any effect it may have on special language or cultural rights in Alberta? Does that affect our educational program in terms of the change of the format that we must use in the future, or any other provision that must be made by the Government of Alberta to meet that requirement?
Well, it's a good point, Mr. Speaker, and I guess one only has to go to Quebec and recognize, when you travel there, that it is a distinct society, different from Alberta when you're there. I think it's so. What we were doing was confirming a fact of Canada. But we did at least twice bring in the best constitutional minds, legal minds, to our meeting and question very, very directly on the issue. Does this reduce the position of any group in Canada, such as the English-speaking Canadians in Quebec? Can they in some way lose their rights? The answer is no. Does it give new powers to the government of Quebec to do something in their province? It does not. Does it hurt or the citizens of Alberta or any other province in terms of what they might have to do within their province? And it does not. And we confirmed that at least twice with the best constitutional minds at separate times in our meeting.
Mr. Speaker, my final supplementary is with regards to Section 47(1), and it places limitations on the effectiveness of the Senate in terms of the 180 days. Yes, that's correct, 180 days. Could the Premier indicate in accepting that clause what the inference is in terms of this whole concept of a more effective Senate? And does it take the teeth out of the current Senate by placing that in the accord?
No, Mr. Speaker, I do not believe it in any way impacts on the chances of an effective Senate. In no way.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. The Premier mentions that you got unanimous agreement, but he neglects to mention that this unanimous agreement on all these cases was given up by somebody trading something for something. In other words, Quebec, to get Quebec into the Constitution, appointment of judges, a distinct society, and of course unanimous because the Premier's got a right to appoint the senators. What I want to ask the Premier then, stemming from that unanimity seems to only be able to come about if you're willing to trade something for something. And now that the Premier wants the Triple E Senate, what does he imagine he is going to change, or what he's imagined he's going to trade to the other provinces to get them to give their unanimous approval to the Triple E. What is he going to give up?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is such a remarkably jaundiced view of Canada that I have ever heard. Because, and such a lack of faith in the proposition that we advocate of the Triple E Senate. I mean, he's already started out whipped. He's already started out whipped. He doesn't believe he can get it, so how could he convince anybody of it? I mean, I absolutely have recognized. I've absolutely recognized, and I must say I sympathize with the honourable member because of the weakness of his party's position in this whole matter. But Albertans want the Triple E Senate, and Canadians all over this country are seeing the wisdom of it, and support for it is growing, and we're going to keep fighting. And we're going to try and get that. We know we're going to get Senate reform. We're going to try and get it to the Triple E, and that will be, as this whole constitutional accord is, a great day for Canada.
Edmonton Highlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier as well. I wonder if the Premier would indicate to the House if it was to a quote of mine from my news release of yesterday that he was referring when he distorted the position of the New Democrats in response to the question from the member for Banff Cochrane.
Mr. Speaker, I would never distort a matter of the New Democrats. It's too clear what they stand for.
No, this is my series of questions. You bet. Mr. Speaker, I think that I'd like to, seeing as how I didn't give a preamble before, read what I said yesterday, which was, oh no, I can quote from myself, and this is my writing. That's right. Quote, the revised agreement appears to pave the way for new national programs such as daycare. New Democrats are pleased that this has been achieved and hopeful that the final text will prove satisfactory. Was that the quote that the Premier was referring to when he went into his distorting tirade?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can understand the discomfort that the honourable member has and that the party has, because they have been caught right on the philosophical belief they have of a huge central government dominated in Canada. And in order to have that they are dominated in Ottawa. Now, in order to get that, they are prepared to give up the exclusive provincial jurisdiction which the Constitution gives us. It's so fundamentally different in this legislature on that issue that I hope all Albertans are clear on it.
Well, supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, from the member whose political party gave Canada, through provincial means, things like Medicare. Does the Premier honestly believe that it is the position of the New Democrats that we don't stand up for greater provincial responsibility and jurisdiction, such as fought for by the likes of Grant Notley and the Leader of the Opposition? Does he really believe that?
With due respect, Honourable. With due respect, Honourable Premier, there's a difficulty here because, according to Beauchesne, Minister is only answerable for something that falls within his department, and I doubt that the New Democratic Party philosophy somehow relates to your office. But supplementary question.
Explain it very well.
Yeah, final supplementary question.
Doesn't know it.
Perhaps to the Premier, who may have a bit more authority on historical matters, would he confirm then that he recognizes that wonderful programs like Medicare were in fact instituted provincially by the New Democrats, and that indicates our sponsorship of good provincial programs?
I will, Mr. Speaker, come back to the original point of the fundamental difference between our two parties. They believe in state control and large governments. They are philosophically committed to that. I understand, Mr. Speaker, I understand completely their discomfort because it's clear that they are prepared to bargain away provincial rights and exclusive provincial jurisdiction in order to have stronger government in Ottawa dominating the provinces. We will never agree to that, and they are discomforted over that.
Time for question period has expired. Might we complete this series of questions? Opposed? Any additional supplementaries? Calgary Buffalo.
Yes, in light of the Premier's comments with respect to federal encroachments on provincial jurisdiction, I wonder whether the Premier might advise us as to which of the Medicare programs or the old age pension or the unemployment insurance or the university funding programs, which are federal encroachments on provincial jurisdiction, the Premier would see us do without.
Again, I can see where the Liberal Party would try and salvage something from the shambles of which they are in. There's a considerable difference when you enter into an agreement than when you have one imposed, Mr. Speaker. Tremendous difference.
Orders of the day. Might we revert to the introduction of special guests?